In the twilight of his life, Edward Calloway, a retired historian burdened by regret and the loss of his family, embarks on a final journey to India, a land he had always dreamed of but never visited. Driven by the whispers of a mystical legend, he discovers an ancient map leading to a sacred gem believed to hold the power to heal and destroy. With only his will and the unpredictable guidance of a young local guide, he ventures into the unknown, unaware of the cosmic battle his actions are about to unleash. Edward Calloway sat in his study, surrounded by relics of his past, clutching a leather-bound journal. The journal had belonged to Margaret, his late wife, a woman who had shared his passion for discovery but had left him with an empty house and a heavier heart. Within its pages, he found an intricate sketch of an ancient map accompanied by her notes about a sacred gem hidden in India. The gem, according to Margaret's writings, was said to possess powers that could heal and destroy. The discovery stirred something dormant in Edward. At 73, he felt his life's purpose had long faded, but the journal reignited a spark. The gem seemed to represent more than legend. It was Margaret's final wish, a journey she never had the chance to take. For weeks, Edward wrestled with doubts. The frailty of his body and the whispers of practicality told him to let it go, but the longing to honor Margaret's dream and his own curiosity prevailed. One evening, he booked a ticket to India with the last of his savings. The flight was grueling, but the sights and sounds of New Delhi jolted him awake. The chaos of the city overwhelmed him. Blaring horns, bustling markets, and vivid colors blending into a tapestry of life. Yet, amid the commotion, Edward felt a strange sense of purpose. Determined to decipher the map and find the gem, Edward sought help. A recommendation led him to Ayan, a sharp-eyed guide whose skeptical grin said he had seen his share of eccentric tourists. "You're chasing a myth," Ayan remarked after Edward laid out his story. Edward showed him the journal. "This is real. I have to find it. For her." The sincerity in Edward's voice softened Ayan's resistance. After some hesitation, Ayan agreed to accompany him, albeit with a warning. "This isn't just a stroll in the park, old man. The jungles are dangerous, and so are the people looking for treasures like this." The two set off the next morning, leaving behind the city's cacophony for the rolling countryside. Fields of mustard flowers stretched endlessly under the sun, and villages dotted with ancient temples painted a serene backdrop. Edward, though weary, felt alive for the first time in years. Their first destination was Jaipur, where they sought answers in a crumbling library rumored to hold manuscripts on the gem's history. The librarian, an elderly woman with an enigmatic smile, guided them to a dusty volume. Inside was a passage that sent chills down Edward's spine. The gem of Amritanagar holds the essence of life itself, but bears a curse for those unworthy. Edward copied the details onto a sheet of paper, his mind racing. The gem's last known location was an abandoned temple deep in Rajasthan's forests. The journey ahead promised danger and uncertainty, but as Edward stepped out of the library clutching the map, he felt ready. For Margaret, for redemption, and for the mystery of the gem, there was no turning back. The morning air in Rajasthan was thick with spice and dust as Edward and Ayan journeyed deeper into the countryside. Edward watched the world unfold through the window of their battered jeep. Vivid saris, ancient temples, and fields dotted with grazing cattle. The air hummed with a sense of mystery, and every sight filled Edward with anticipation. The map, clutched in his lap, guided their path toward a forgotten temple hidden deep in the forests. "You're too quiet," Ayan remarked, his hands gripping the wheel. "Second thoughts?" "Not at all," Edward replied. "Just taking it all in." "Good," Ayan said, though his expression betrayed a hint of unease. "But don't forget, the deeper we go, the more dangerous it gets. The forests don't like outsiders." Their route narrowed into dirt paths bordered by dense foliage. They stopped in a small village on the forest's edge, where Ayan spoke with a local elder. Though Edward couldn't understand their words, The elder's wary expression and sharp gestures spoke volumes. "He says the temple is cursed," Ayan explained when he returned. "No one goes there. Spirits, traps, you name it. But he pointed us in the right direction." The jeep bounced along the uneven trail, and as they ventured deeper, the forest closed in around them. Towering trees filtered the sunlight into a dim, green haze. The air grew cooler, the hum of insects louder. Edward felt an unsettling weight in his chest, as though the forest itself was alive and watching. When they finally reached the temple clearing, Edward's breath caught. The ancient stone structure was massive, its carvings worn by centuries of rain and wind. Vines crawled over its walls, obscuring parts of its facade, but its majesty was undeniable. This was the place Margaret had written about, the heart of her dream. Ayan led the way inside, flashlight in hand. The air was thick with damp and decay, the faint scent of earth lingering. Edward moved cautiously, his historian's instincts driving him to examine the intricate carvings on the walls. Mythical creatures intertwined with cryptic symbols, their meanings just out of reach. They reached the central chamber where an altar stood in the shadows. Edward stepped forward, his hands trembling as he traced the faded inscriptions on its surface. "This is it," he murmured, his voice barely audible. But as he leaned closer, a noise echoed through the chamber. Ayan turned sharply, his flashlight revealing a gaunt man standing in the doorway. He held a rusted machete, his face unreadable but his intent clear. "What do you want?" Ayan asked, his tone calm but firm. The man's lips curled into a sinister smile. "The same thing you do," he replied before lunging forward. Chaos erupted as Ayan shoved Edward aside, meeting the man's attack with swift precision. The struggle was brief but violent, ending with Ayan disarming the stranger and pinning him to the ground. "Who sent you?" Ayan demanded, but the man refused to answer, muttering curses before slipping unconscious. Edward, shaken but unhurt, stared at the altar. His resolve only grew stronger. Danger was inevitable, but the promise of the gem, and the answers it held, was worth the risk. Whatever lay ahead, he would not turn back. Edward stood in the temple chamber, steadying his breath as the echoes of the intruder's attack faded. The air inside was damp, heavy with the weight of history. The altar before him, carved with intricate symbols, seemed to hum with latent energy. Ayan secured the unconscious man with rope, tying him to a nearby pillar. "We'll deal with him later," Ayan muttered. "For now, focus on this trial of yours." Edward opened Margaret's journal, comparing its notes to the carvings on the altar. The symbols depicted life and death, creation and destruction, all revolving around a central gem radiating light. "This is it," Edward murmured. "The gem, it's real, and this altar guards its path." "What do these symbols mean?" Ayan asked, eyeing the altar warily. Edward ran his fingers over the carvings. "The gem is protected by a trial. Only those who align the forces of balance, light and shadow, life and death, can proceed. It's a test." "And if we fail?" Ayan asked. Edward didn't answer, pressing on a carved panel instead. The altar groaned and shifted, revealing a hidden mechanism, levers and dials arranged in a complex puzzle. "This is it," Edward said, his excitement cutting through the tension. "We need to solve this." As Edward began to work, Ayan stood guard. The air grew colder and faint whispers echoed through the chamber. Shadows flickered unnaturally, their shapes twisting in ways that defied logic. "Hurry up," Ayan urged, his grip tightening on his knife. "We're not alone." Edward focused, sliding panels into place and turning the levers. The glowing edges of the symbols showed progress, but the whispers intensified, shifting into menacing chants. Shadows coalesced into vague humanoid shapes with hollow eyes that seemed to watch their every move. "Edward!" Ayan shouted. "Finish it now!" With a final turn of a lever, the altar emitted a blinding light that filled the chamber. The whispers ceased, and the shadows dissipated. Edward stumbled back as the ground trembled beneath them. When the light faded, the altar revealed a hidden compartment. Inside lay a small map and an ornate key. Edward picked up the key, its weight grounding him. "This is the way forward," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "The trial is only beginning." A groan from the corner interrupted their relief. The restrained intruder was awake, his eyes filled with rage. "You don't know what you've started," he rasped. "The gem's power will consume you." Ignoring the man's warning, Ayan pulled Edward toward the exit. "Let's move before his friends arrive." Emerging into the dense forest, Edward studied the new map. It pointed them further into the wilderness, toward the gem's true resting place. The legend was real, and so were the dangers. Unseen by the pair, a figure emerged from the temple's shadows, its unblinking eyes fixed on their retreat. The jungle buzzed with life, yet an eerie silence seemed to follow Edward and Ayan as they ventured deeper. The map became harder to follow, the dense vegetation clawing at their clothes. Edward felt the weight of the key in his pocket, a constant reminder of the danger ahead. "Keep moving," Ayan urged, slicing through vines. "The less time we waste, the better." Edward adjusted his bag, his breath labored. "Who are we running from exactly?" "People who'd kill for a myth," Ayan replied, his voice grim. "Like our friend back at the temple, and whoever sent him." Hours passed as shadows stretched across the jungle floor. They stopped near a cluster of ancient trees with twisted roots like gnarled hands. Ayan handed Edward a canteen. "Drink," he said. "We've got a long night ahead." Edward accepted it, glancing at the treetops. Despite the heat, he shivered. The forest felt alive, as though unseen eyes were watching. A sudden snap of a twig froze him mid-sip. Ayan rose to his feet, knife in hand. "We're not alone," he whispered. From the undergrowth emerged a group of men, their faces obscured by scarves. Weapons glinted in the fading light as they surrounded the pair. The leader, taller than the rest, stepped forward with a mocking grin. "Well, well," he said, "treasure hunters." Ayan stepped forward defensively. "We're just passing through, no trouble." The leader chuckled darkly. "Carrying a map and key? That's trouble enough. Hand it over, old man, and we might let you leave." Edward's heart raced, but he gripped the key tightly. "You don't understand," he said. "This isn't about treasure. It's bigger than you know." The leader's smile faded. "Don't care. Hand it over." Before Edward could respond, Ayan lunged. Chaos erupted as the attackers retaliated, their shouts mingling with the rustling jungle. Edward ducked behind a tree, clutching the key as the fight raged. Ayan's speed and skill turned the tide, leaving the attackers groaning on the ground. "Let's go," Ayan said, pulling Edward to his feet. They fled into the jungle as darkness fell. Edward's chest heaved, his mind racing. He glanced back, half expecting to see more pursuers, but the forest seemed to close in behind them. When they finally stopped, Ayan leaned against a tree, blood staining his shirt. "This isn't just about the gem," he said, his voice low. "These men are part of something bigger. They won't stop." Edward nodded, his resolve hardening. The gem wasn't just a curiosity anymore. It was something worth fighting for. Whatever dangers lay ahead, he couldn't turn back now. As they prepared to move again, Edward glanced at the map. Their destination was close, but the jungle held more secrets, and its shadows promised further threats. Night fell over the jungle, draping it in a shroud of darkness punctuated only by the glow of fireflies. Edward and Ayan trudged on, their breaths shallow as they pushed past exhaustion. The map guided them through twisting paths, deeper into the heart of the wilderness. Every rustle in the foliage sent a chill down Edward's spine, but it was not the jungle alone that unnerved him. It was the growing sense that something unseen was guiding their journey. "We should stop soon," Ayan said, his voice low. "Traveling blind at night is suicide." Reluctantly, Edward agreed, and they set up camp near a clearing. Ayan lit a small fire, its flickering light creating dancing shadows on the trees. Edward sat cross-legged, the journal and map spread before him. His fingers traced the lines on the map, but his mind was elsewhere, on Margaret, on the gem, and on the life he had spent running from dreams that now seemed too close. As Edward dozed by the fire, a strange sensation overtook him. The jungle's sounds faded, replaced by an otherworldly hum that resonated deep in his chest. His vision blurred, and he found himself standing in a place he didn't recognize, a vast temple courtyard bathed in golden light. Figures moved around him, their faces serene yet unfamiliar. They wore robes adorned with intricate patterns that shimmered like stars. At the center of the courtyard stood a pedestal, and atop it lay the gem. Its light pulsed gently, as if alive. A figure stepped forward, a man with piercing eyes that seemed to see through Edward. "You seek the gem," the man said, his voice both a whisper and a thunderclap. "But do you understand its power?" Edward tried to speak, but his voice failed him. The man continued. "The gem is not a prize. It is a responsibility. It holds the essence of balance, of life and death. Those who misuse it face ruin. Only those with true purpose may wield it." The scene shifted violently, the serene courtyard replaced by chaos. The gem's light turned harsh and blinding, and Edward saw visions of destruction. Forests consumed by fire, rivers drying to dust, and shadows overtaking the land. He fell to his knees, overwhelmed. Suddenly the vision faded, and Edward awoke with a start. The fire had burned low, and the jungle was quiet. Ayan was on watch, his silhouette tense against the dim glow. "You were talking in your sleep," Ayan said, not turning around. Something about balance and destruction. Edward's hands trembled as he recounted the vision, sparing no detail. Ayan listened in silence, his expression unreadable. "You think it was real?" Ayan asked finally. "I don't know," Edward admitted, "but it felt like a warning. This gem, it's more than I imagined. We can't let it fall into the wrong hands." Ayan nodded slowly. "Then we'd better make sure we're the ones who find it first." The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence, but Edward's resolve hardened. The gem was not just a treasure. It was a force that could shape the world. He had come too far to turn back now. Dawn broke over the jungle as Edward and Ayan followed the map toward the hidden temple. The stone path they found was cracked and overgrown, yet its carvings radiated an ancient power. They approached a towering gate carved with shifting patterns. Edward ran his fingers across the symbols. "This is it. The trials begin here." "What kind of trials?" Ayan asked, his tone wary. Edward gestured to an inscription above the archway. "Tests of balance, physical, mental, and spiritual. Only the worthy may proceed." With effort, they pushed the gate open, revealing a courtyard surrounded by towering walls. 3 paths branched out from the center, each marked with a unique symbol. Edward studied the map, his brow furrowed. "We need to choose carefully. Each path leads to a trial." "I'll take the one with the sword," Ayan said, pointing to the path marked by a blade. Without waiting, he strode forward, disappearing into the shadows. Edward lingered, his heart pounding, before choosing the path marked by a flame. The air grew hotter with each step Edward took. The walls seemed to close in, and the path ended in a chamber where fire erupted from the ground, forming a labyrinth of burning obstacles. An inscription caught his eye. "To proceed, embrace both the burn and the light." Edward hesitated, his historian's instincts warring with his fear. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, navigating the flames. The fire seemed to test his resolve, flaring brighter when he doubted but parting when he focused. Each step felt like a lifetime, but when he reached the other side, He collapsed, singed but alive. Meanwhile, Ayan's trial was no less harrowing. The path of the sword led him to a circular chamber where statues of warriors lined the walls. As he stepped forward, the statues came to life, their stone blades gleaming. Ayan's instincts took over. He fought with precision, dodging strikes and countering with speed. The trial wasn't just about strength, it demanded strategy. By the time the last statue fell still, Ayan was battered but triumphant. They reunited at the courtyard, their faces reflecting exhaustion and determination. That was something, Ayan said, catching his breath. What now? Edward pointed to the final path, marked with an eye. The last trial. It's mine. The path led Edward to a room filled with mirrors. Each surface reflected endless versions of him, shifting with every movement. A voice echoed, "To find truth, confront your reflection." Edward stepped closer, watching the mirrors change. He saw himself as a young man, blinded by ambition and arrogance. Margaret's face appeared, her love mingled with disappointment. Finally, he saw himself now, aged, regretful, but resolute. "I accept who I was," Edward said aloud, "and I choose who I am now." The mirrors shattered, revealing a hidden doorway. Edward stepped through to find Ayan waiting. Together, they approached a central chamber where a pedestal glowed faintly, radiating power. "This is the end of the trials," Edward said, awe in his voice. "The gem is close." Before they could move forward, the silence was broken by the sound of footsteps echoing through the temple. They weren't alone. The sound of footsteps echoed ominously through the temple's stone corridors, sending shivers down Edward's spine. Ayan drew his knife, his body tense. "Stay behind me," he whispered. From the shadows emerged a familiar figure, the man they had left tied up at the previous temple. His bonds had been cut, and a malicious grin spread across his face. "You didn't think I'd give up that easily, did you?" he sneered. "How did you escape?" Ayan growled, stepping forward. The man smirked, gesturing behind him. More figures appeared, their silhouettes barely visible in the dim light. "I've got friends. And now you're outnumbered." Edward's heart raced. He clutched the key in his pocket, its weight grounding him. "What do you want?" "The same thing you do," the man replied. "But unlike you, I know how to use it." Ayan lunged at the man, but his movements were cut short as one of the attackers struck from the side, forcing him to defend himself. Chaos erupted as the group descended upon them. Edward backed away, his mind racing. He had no weapon, no way to fight. Suddenly, one of the attackers reached for Edward's pocket, trying to grab the key. Edward stumbled, clutching it tightly. "You don't understand," he shouted. "The gem isn't just a treasure, it's dangerous." "Spare me the lectures," the man growled, his eyes gleaming with greed. "Hand it over." The struggle escalated, but Ayan's skill kept the attackers at bay. With a swift motion, he disarmed one and turned their weapon against the others. Blood stained the chamber floor as shouts echoed off the stone walls. Edward's desperation grew as the man lunged at him again, knocking him to the ground. The key slipped from his grasp, skidding across the floor. Both men scrambled for it, but Edward's hand closed around it first. Summoning his courage, he shoved the man away and scrambled to his feet. A sudden roar filled the chamber, stopping everyone in their tracks. The pedestal at the center began to glow, its light pulsing like a heartbeat. The attackers hesitated, their greed giving way to fear. "The gem is responding," Edward murmured. "It knows we're here." The ground trembled and the walls seemed to close in. Ayan grabbed Edward's arm, pulling him toward the exit. "We need to leave, now." "But the gem," Edward protested. "We're not ready," Ayan snapped. "If we stay, we die." Reluctantly, Edward followed, the attackers scattering in all directions as the temple began to collapse. The air filled with dust and the deafening sound of stone grinding against stone. They emerged into the jungle, gasping for air. Behind them, the temple's entrance crumbled, sealing the attackers inside. Ayan leaned against a tree, his face pale. "That wasn't just a fight," he said, his voice trembling. "That was a warning." Edward nodded, his hands trembling as he held the key. The gem's power wasn't just a legend. It was alive, and it was watching. The jungle was eerily silent as Edward and Ayan pressed forward, their escape from the collapsing temple weighing heavily on them. Every step brought them closer to their goal and deeper into danger. They paused in a clearing where a towering obelisk stood, its surface etched with intricate symbols that seemed to shift under the light. Edward held the key tightly, its metal warm against his palm. "This is it," he said, his voice hushed. "We're close." The carvings on the obelisk told a story of the gem's immense power, creation and destruction, balance and chaos. Edward traced the symbols with his fingers, his historian's instincts unraveling their meaning. "It's a warning," he murmured. "The gem isn't just powerful, it can reshape everything, for better or worse." As he spoke, the obelisk began to hum. The key in Edward's hand glowed faintly, its light pulsating in rhythm with the vibrations. The ground beneath them trembled, revealing a hidden staircase spiraling downward into the earth. Ayan cast a wary glance at Edward. "This feels like a trap." "Or a test," Edward replied. "Either way, there's no turning back now." They descended cautiously, the air growing colder with each step. The staircase opened into a vast chamber, its walls shimmering with faint light. At its center rested the gem of Amritanagar, its light mesmerizing and alive. Edward approached slowly, the key pulling him forward. "This is it," he whispered, his breath catching in his throat. "The gem." Ayan stayed back, his instincts screaming caution. "Are you sure about this?" Edward nodded, placing the key into a slot on the pedestal. The chamber trembled as the gem's light flared, flooding the room with brilliance. Edward felt a surge of energy coursing through him, overwhelming and intoxicating. Visions flooded his mind, visions of creation, destruction, balance restored, and chaos unleashed. He saw Margaret's face, her voice echoing in his thoughts. "Be careful, Edward. Not all power is meant to be held." The intensity overwhelmed him, and Edward staggered back, clutching his head. "It's alive," he gasped. "The gem. It's testing me." Ayan rushed to steady him. "Then let it go," he said firmly. "We're not here to take it. We're here to protect it." Edward nodded, the visions fading as he released the key. The gem's light dimmed and the chamber stilled, leaving behind a profound silence. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Before they could process what had happened, the silence was broken by the sound of footsteps. They turned to see a shadowed figure emerging from the staircase, flanked by armed men. The leader stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the gem. "You've done the hard work for us," he said, a smirk curling his lips. "Now, step aside." Ayan drew his knife, positioning himself between Edward and the intruders. Not a chance. The leader's expression darkened. "Then you'll die with your secrets." The chamber trembled again as the gem's light flared unpredictably, reacting to the tension in the room. Edward's heart pounded as he realized the truth. The gem wasn't a mere artifact. It was a force, alive and aware, and it wouldn't be claimed without consequence. The chamber trembled as the gem's light intensified, casting sharp shadows across the walls. Edward clutched the key tightly, his heart pounding. The leader of the intruders stepped forward, his eyes locked on the glowing gem. "Hand over the key," he demanded. Edward shook his head, his voice steady despite his fear. "You don't understand. This gem isn't just a relic, it's alive." The man's lips curled into a sneer. "Then it belongs to me. Take them." Chaos erupted as the intruders lunged. Ayan met them with ferocity, his knife flashing in the gem's pulsating glow. Edward stumbled back, his focus torn between the melee and the artifact. The gem's light seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, pulling him toward it. "Ayan!" Edward shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "Hold them off! I need time." "Time for what?" Ayan barked, narrowly avoiding a blade. "Just trust me." Edward turned to the pedestal, inserting the key into its slot. The chamber trembled violently as the gem's glow grew blinding. Visions overtook Edward, visions of balance restored and chaos unleashed. A voice echoed in his mind. Only sacrifice can bring harmony. The meaning was clear. The gem's power demanded a price, one that could seal its energy forever or risk it falling into the wrong hands. Behind him, Ayan let out a cry of pain, forcing Edward to turn. The fight had turned desperate. An attacker charged toward Edward, but the gem's light flared, throwing the man backward with an unseen force. Edward turned back to the pedestal, his resolve hardening. Taking a deep breath, Edward made his choice. With all his strength, he turned the key one final time. The gem's light erupted, engulfing the chamber in a blinding glow. The air buzzed with energy, and Edward felt a piece of himself being pulled away. The attackers were thrown to the ground, their weapons clattering. Ayan shielded his eyes, shouting Edward's name, but the sound was drowned out by the gem's crescendo. Edward felt a strange calm settle over him, as if the gem understood his intent. When the light dimmed, the chamber was silent. The gem sat inert on its pedestal, its glow extinguished. Edward collapsed to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion. Ayan rushed to his side, gripping his shoulder. "Edward, are you all right?" Edward nodded weakly. "It's done. The gem's power is sealed. No one can use it now." Together, they climbed the staircase back to the surface. The intruders had fled, their retreat marked by abandoned weapons. The jungle's sunlight greeted them as they emerged, its warmth contrasting the cold stillness of the chamber below. Edward turned to Ayan, his voice steady despite his fatigue. "Thank you for everything." Ayan smirked, his usual humor returning. "Don't thank me yet. We still have to make it out of this jungle." They began their trek back, the path ahead uncertain but their mission clear. The gem's power was no longer a threat, but its lesson would endure. A reminder that some treasures are not meant to be claimed. Edward glanced at the horizon, a bittersweet smile on his lips. Margaret had been right all along. True balance required sacrifice. And for the first time in years, he felt at peace. The jungle buzzed with life as Edward and Ayan made their way back toward civilization. The weight of their journey hung heavily on them, but for the first time, Edward felt a lightness in his chest. The gem's power was sealed and its danger neutralized. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. They reached a small village where Edward finally allowed himself to rest. Sitting beneath a banyan tree, he opened Margaret's journal, running his fingers over her handwriting. Her dream had brought him here, and though she was gone, Edward knew she would have understood the sacrifice he had made. "You okay?" Ayan asked, sitting beside him. Edward nodded. "For the first time in a long while, I think I am." Ayan smirked. "Not bad for an old man." Edward chuckled, the sound feeling foreign after weeks of tension. "You weren't so bad yourself." As the sun set, Edward felt drawn to the jungle one last time. Something about the temple's ruins felt unfinished, like a chapter he hadn't fully closed. Ayan, ever skeptical, insisted on accompanying him. They stopped at the edge of the jungle. Edward placed a hand on Ayan's shoulder. "You don't have to come. I just need a moment." Ayan hesitated before nodding. "Don't take too long. This place has enough ghosts for one lifetime." Edward walked alone to the crumbled temple, the weight of the journey resurfacing. Standing at the entrance, he whispered, "Thank you, Margaret." The wind picked up, carrying a sense of peace. Edward turned back, his steps lighter. The jungle's shadows seemed less foreboding, its mysteries a part of a world he now understood. Back at the village, Edward packed his belongings. The journal went into his bag last, its pages a reminder of Margaret's dream. He turned to Aya Ann, offering his hand. "Thank you. I couldn't have done this without you." Ayan shook it firmly. "Take care of yourself, old man." Edward smiled. "You too. And remember, some treasures aren't meant to be kept." Ayan nodded as Edward climbed into a jeep bound for the airport. The ride was long, but Edward welcomed the silence, his thoughts drifting to all he had seen and done. As the plane lifted off, he looked out at the jungle fading into the horizon, feeling a sense of closure he hadn't thought possible. Back home, Edward returned to his quiet house. The relics and books that once felt like burdens now seemed like companions. He placed Margaret's journal on his desk, its presence a comforting reminder of the journey they had shared. Sitting by the window, Edward watched the sunrise, its golden light spilling over the horizon. The gem had tested him, but it had also given him something he thought he'd lost: peace. And with that peace came a newfound purpose. Edward picked up his pen and began to write. His story wasn't over. It had only just begun.